So today we're going to continue with our series on prayer, and I want to actually maybe break the rules this morning and take it a little wider than prayer. It's something God has really put in my heart, just really to bring this message to you. As you know, I haven't been well for a number of weeks, so this message has been sitting, waiting to come this morning. So we're going to read from Nehemiah. Now, it is a number of verses. You know me, I do like to read, but I want to just set the context. And Nehemiah is a wonderful book to read. Take time later to read it. We can learn so much from the book of Nehemiah. So I'm going to read just a couple of verses in chapter 1, and then I'm going to jump into chapter 2 and read from there. So the words of Nehemiah, son of Halakhi. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I want to jump now into chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, you just have to pause and laugh or think for a moment about this. Nehemiah not only prays, he comes to the king, but he takes it a step further. Let's just read and continue. Then I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me with safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Ashpaf, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat and Horonite, the Tobiah the Ammonite of the official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went through the valley gate towards the Jackal well and the Dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you in rebellion against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim on historic right to it. On Thursday morning, I was having my quiet time, and I'd stepped into sermon preparation for today. And it was one of those moments where I was wrestling with what I had prepared. That often happens. I'm sure Dan and there's others in the room. You have this word prepared, and all of a sudden, then God gives you a little tap on the shoulder and maybe swishes it about a bit, changes it a bit. And I want to begin with a rhetorical question this morning. How has your week been as a follower of Jesus? How has your week been as a follower of Jesus? Perhaps this week you have soared with the Lord. You have enjoyed time in his presence. You have heard his voice and known his promptings in your life. Prayer has been frequent. Hours of Bible study refreshing. Family life has been smooth. Work has been fulfilling. Maybe that's how you would answer me this morning. But I want to be real and transparent with you. My week has not been like that. It has been a challenging week for many different reasons, which I can't go into this morning. But those challenges have made me say to Robert, I don't know how to pray for this. I don't know how to pray for these situations. I've really felt against the wall and not knowing how to pray because of the challenges that I face at the moment. So this morning, I want to bring that, to draw on that, my challenges, which maybe you will relate to, but also to draw on the fact that as a Christian, that God has this all covered. So I am talking to moi here this morning, first of all. This message is for me, but it's also maybe it will encourage you today. I want to borrow something from the writings of John Maxwell. Some of you will know John Maxwell does a lot of teaching on leadership and leadership in ministry. Well, I want to borrow his framework this morning and rewrite it slightly just to apply it to our lives. So I've borrowed it from him. I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know, but it's maybe good to be reminded this morning, just like me. I need to be reminded. I need the Holy Spirit to remind me this morning of this. And so we begin. Christians who walk faithfully with God have at least 4 characteristics. Now, when John Maxwell wrote that, he was talking to leaders, but I wanted to use it for us this morning. I'm just going to read them out quickly, and then we're going to look at the life of Nehemiah and how it would apply to us. So this is 4 characteristics that you and I who walk faithfully with God should have, or we want to have, if I could say that. A compelling purpose. They make a great commitment to a great cause. A continual prayer. They pray about everything and gain God's favor. A clear perspective. They don't let fear cloud their view of the future. A courageous persistence. They move ahead despite the odds. And all of these, I believe, we can see in the life of Nehemiah. Now, we don't have time to look at all the book of Nehemiah. It's such a great book. But let's look at the first one, a compelling purpose. They make a great commitment to a great cause. Of course, for Nehemiah, he has this news that comes to him about Jerusalem and about the walls that have not been rebuilt. And as I thought about this, I thought about Esther, who was a little before Nehemiah, and there was that time where Esther was raised up. And you remember in the book of Esther, Mordecai says to her, maybe God has raised you to this position for such a time as this. And I believe that we see that in the life of Nehemiah. God has brought him to such a time as this. It's not only the walls that are falling down, but this obviously gives us a picture of what the lives of the people of Israel were like when it come to God. And in chapter 1, we read how Nehemiah's heart was broken. Now, you might think this morning, oh, well, that's okay for that Nehemiah guy. He's, called by God to do this. But if you think about his life, he was a cupbearer. He was before the Persian king, so he sampled, he tasted the food and drink of the king. So he wasn't a minister, he wasn't a vicar, he wasn't in that era at all. Nehemiah, he wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a priest, but he was a Jewish exile working for a foreign government. And he did his secular job so well that the king trusted him. But we see how Nehemiah, he has this compelling purpose and a commitment to what God has called him to do. And I think about later on in Nehemiah chapter 6, it says a wonderful book, but he says, I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should I stop while I leave it and go down to you? A compelling purpose and commitment. A few weeks ago, I had a phone call from a friend who's a pastor. Just out of the blue, I was in the car, I was driving to see someone, and he says, hello, Pastor Trudi, I need to talk to you. And it has been a joke along the years that we've known other. He calls me his pastor. He says, I need some encouragement this morning. So he started to share with me how things weren't going as he thought, the things in the church and just in life in general. And as he talked, and as I was driving in the car, I was hands-free, by the way. I wasn't using my phone and talking at the same time, but I was hands-free. I said to him, there was a time in my life where I had that purpose and commitment, and I really had to really dig in hard for that whenever I hadn't good health, and I had to step out of ministry and work in an admin job. That's what I did for a number of years. But that was my calling at that time. I had purpose and commitment to that. And I was wanting to encourage him that sometimes we have to dig in. We really do. We have to dig in and have that compelling purpose and stick with it and have commitment. I read a story this week about a pastor, and he preached a message, a bit like Sunday morning in the church, and he preached this message to the church family about making a serious commitment to the church. He wanted them to volunteer within the church, attend regularly, give of their offerings. And the pastor, he stressed to those listening, this is one of those sermons, you're making a vow of commitment, and it should not be taken lightly. Unknown to those in the room, in the congregation, there was a member. This is probably an American story. There was a member, and he was thinking about buying a boat. Well, English people buy boats too, but anyway, I'm thinking it's American. He felt God was calling him to buy a boat. Now, his wife was of different thoughts when it come to the boat. Anyway, the pastor preached. He asked, for people to make the commitment, to make this real commitment to the church. And not to hold on to those things that would prevent them from being committed. The man, he squirmed in his seat as he listened to the message about commitment. Anyway, after the service, he came forward, had a word with the pastor. He said to him, Pastor, I think God still wants me to have that boat. It's really clear to me now that I should have the boat and maybe start a Sunday school class up in the boat on a Sunday. That would show my commitment. The pastor, of course, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he expected. Being committed, a compelling purpose. Nehemiah, we see that in his life. He had this purpose, and he was committed to it. And as you read Nehemiah, you would think that the answer to his prayer happened really quickly when the news had come to him about the walls being broken down, and then he's before the king. But there was at least 100 days in between the prayer that was sent up to God and the prayer and the fasting before the answer came. And of course, Nehemiah, he comes before the king and he says to him, this is my need. He brings this need before the king. What about you today? What about your purpose and your commitment to that purpose? Is God maybe speaking to you this morning about how you stand? It's not easy. It's easy to talk the talk, but it's much harder to walk the walk. A compelling purpose and commitment. What's God calling you to do? Why are you here? What's he saying to you today? Nehemiah is so clear. God had spoken to him. He'd put it on his heart that this is what he was to do. But what about me and what about you this morning? We also see that Nehemiah, he was a continual prayer. And this is another characteristic that we as Christians should be striving to have, a continual prayer. They pray about everything and gain God's favor. Nehemiah saw the need. It was a tall order that was put in front of him. Basically, he had to change the mind of the king. And he prays to God in verse 11 of chapter 1, please grant me success today. Nehemiah brought the request before God in continual prayer. And if you were to go through the book of Nehemiah, you would see how often he turns to prayer. That continual prayer before God. Pray about everything. And he did. He brought it before God. He brought it before God. Even how he goes out and he surveys what needs to be done. I love how it says, I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart. Sometimes, we're so impatient, we forget to wait on God. He maybe puts something in our heart. We feel that he's calling us to do something, or he's prompting us, and we fail to wait. And I also love his boldness in prayer. As I was reading it, I said, if you stop and think about it, he doesn't only come to the king and say to the king what he needs. He wants to go back and rebuild the wall. But he also says, I need the wood to do it. I need the timber to do it. He says to the king, I need letters. I need the cavalry to take me. He has that boldness before God. That continual prayer filled with boldness before God. Many of you will be familiar with the story of George Muller. Maybe you've watched the DVD. I remember years ago watching the story of George Muller. And this week as I was preparing, and I didn't realize part of his story. So George Muller was a pastor in a small church in England. This is a bit I didn't know. The church wanted to pay him a good salary from money it received renting pews to rich church members who sat at the front of the church. The poor members had to sit in the cheap seats at the back. I didn't know that about George Muller and his life. Of course, he didn't accept this from them. He said he trusted God to meet the need. And every day as George Muller walked on the streets, he seen boys and girls without families. They were orphans. And George felt God calling him to open an orphanage and take care of the children. He prayed. He asked God to provide him with a building, to provide furniture, money, and everything that he needed. And it's written, God always provided without George telling anyone about his needs. He just prayed and waited on God. One story in particular really stood out for me of the life that George Muller led. One day, the the house mother, she came and she said to him, "George, there's 300 children in the dining room. We've sat them down at the tables. We thank God for the food, but there's no food. We don't have any." But George knew that God would provide the food. So they prayed, and within minutes, the door knocked. It was a baker. He says, "Mr. Muller, last night I could not sleep. Somehow I knew that you would need bread this morning. I got up and baked 3 batches for you. I will bring it in." Soon there was another knock at the door. It was the milkman. His cart had broken down outside. He said to George, the milk will go off. Can I bring it in? Will you have use for it?" And soon those 300 children had enough food and milk for their meal. A continual prayer. They pray about everything. I wish I could stand this morning and honestly say, that's my life, that I pray about everything. Often I go into overdrive and try to fix things myself. But I really feel God speaking to me this morning, and maybe to you this morning, that we do need, as Christians, to have that continual prayer before him. Bring everything before him. Nehemiah saw the need. George Muller saw the need, and they brought it before the Lord. What need is God placing before you this morning? You know, prayer and change go hand in hand. Let's believe that this morning. Prayer and change go hand in hand. Charles Stanley, a well-known American preacher and writer, said about the book of Nehemiah, "We stand tallest and strongest on our knees." We stand tallest and strongest on our knees. And maybe this morning, a bit like me, you're feeling not so strong. Maybe you're feeling the challenges that are coming at you. And I don't mean they don't have to be walls that need built. These can be the simple things of life. But maybe you and I this morning, we need to be reminded that we stand tallest and strongest when we're on our knees. A continual prayer before God. We can also see in Nehemiah that he had a clear perspective. He didn't let fear cloud his view of the future. I love this. You know, he prayed, he waited, but he didn't let that fear cloud his view of the future. You know, you think about, he said to the people, the trouble we're in, you know, he brought it to them. He's surveyed, he knows what needs to be done. God has put it on his heart. And then he says to the people, the gracious hand of my God is on me. And they said, let us start building. Let us start building. Nehemiah was not the only person who saw the need. It lay heavy on his heart, but he had the answer to that need. He had this, that he wanted to not be fearful when it come to the need. And you can only imagine, I can't even imagine, I'm not a builder. I know we have some builders in the room, what it would be like to be called to such a project to do. But his objective is clear. He wants to rebuild the walls of the city. God has called him to do this. He won't let fear stand in his way. And of course, there's also those people who come in opposition. There's always a Sanballat and a Horonite, you know, that comes. They're such hard names to say. But there are always those things. It may be people who come and cause us to fear. It can be our own thoughts and cause us to fear. But Nehemiah, he declares his confidence in God. He knew that God would not let him down. We would see that they had this continual opposition towards him. I read a story about David Wilkinson. Some of you will know, I'll not go into great details, but God really put it on this man's heart to go to New York City. And he said to him, go help those boys. And David Wilkinson, he went And he helped, and he started you'll maybe recognize this better than the name. He started to go among the boys in New York City. And one day he met Nicky Cruz, who was a leader of the wildest and most dangerous gangs. And with a switchblade in the hand, Nicky Cruz said to David, "I'm going to kill you." And he replied, "You could cut me into 1,000 pieces, and every piece of me would cry out that God loves you." Years later, Nicky Cruz, speaking at David Wilkinson's funeral, said, "I've come to say goodbye to my spiritual father. I've told people for years that if it weren't for David Wilkinson, I'd be in the pit of hell today." And of course, David Wilkinson, he produced The Cross and the Switchblade. Maybe you have read that book before. Maybe you have watched the film. He also founded Teen Challenge as well. He went on. God said to him, "Go help those boys." I'm sure David Wilkinson did have some fears whenever God called him to do that. But he knew that God's hand was on him. Go help those boys. Nehemiah saw the need. George Miller saw the need. David Wilkinson, they saw the need. They faced opposition. But God was on their side. And he's on your side this morning. Don't let fear hold you back from what he's calling you to do. I really felt that God was saying to me this morning that as we think about this and having a clear perspective and having that fear, that we're to call that fear out this morning, to leave it. And we will do that in a moment as we pray together, to call out the fear, bring it before God, and then move forward with courageous persistence. We don't leave it there. We don't leave it there with the fear. We move forward with courageous persistence. Read the book later, but if you go into chapter 4 and into chapter 6, you will see how Nehemiah persisted. Opposition intensified. Prayer, he intensified his prayer. He stepped up his prayer as opposition came. He also said to the people in chapter 4, God is with us. He didn't doubt that God was with him. He talks about the weapons we have in our hands. Nehemiah talks about the sound of the trumpet. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, come. And we don't have trumpets today, but I know that whenever we call out to God, he will fight for us. But also I know there's great value in gathering others around us to help to pray for us whenever we go through things. Having that courageous persistence, move ahead despite the odds. Ask people to pray for you. I've been very open this morning and said about my challenges. Don't leave this place saying, with that thing that you're carrying, that fear, whatever it is, ask someone to pray for you this morning. God is with us, the sound of the trumpet. And then we see in chapter 6 of 16, the wall was built. It was completed. Opposition comes in many forms, doubts, our own doubts. But you and I, we are clothed in the righteousness of Christ this morning. He is on our side today. And I'd want to encourage you, as I encourage myself, to have that courageous persistence, despite what's happening all around me, that God has a plan and a purpose. So Christians who walk faithfully with God have at least 4 characteristics. Let me leave this with you as we finish. A compelling purpose. They make a great commitment to a great cause. Nehemiah said, I am carrying out a great project and cannot go down. So what is God prompting you today to commit to? Is it a fresh commitment he's asking you to make? Is he asking you to renew your commitment this morning? Or is there something new that he has placed on your heart today? What's the purpose? What is he prompting you today? What's he asking you to commit to today? a continual prayer. Christians pray about everything and gain God's favor, holding things before Him in prayer. Remember, as you leave this place, we stand tallest and strongest on our knees. The greatest weapon we have, on our knees in prayer. A clear perspective. They don't let fear cloud their view of the future. Call out that fear this morning. Call it out before the Lord. Set it before Him today. Don't let it keep you back from what He has for your future. And have that courageous persistence. They move ahead despite the odds. He had so much going against him, Nehemiah, but yet he moved ahead. The enemy underestimated the power of God at work through Nehemiah. He underestimated it. And we're the same. We're called to be followers of Jesus. We walk with Him. We talk with Him. And this morning, maybe just God is calling you to walk faithfully with Him, to build these 4 characteristics into your life, and to follow His plan and His purpose for your life.